The Justice Department is suing Ferguson, Missouri after city councilors voted Tuesday to reject some of the terms the DOJ and the city had spent more than 6 months negotiating to fix a racist police department. Last March, the Justice Department released a report on Ferguson that found, among other things, although Ferguson's population is just 67% black men and women accounted for 93% of all arrests. A single missed payment of a fine or a citation in Ferguson frequently lands people in jail, and most of those people are black. And the city's law enforcement practices are shaped by revenue needs instead of public need. But the deal is dead. We'll first hear from Ferguson's mayor, then U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch.
There is no reason to enter into an agreement that we know that we cannot live up to, or that is financially impossible to live up to. And it serves no one's purpose for us to fail.
The residents of Ferguson have suffered the deprivation of their constitutional rights, the rights guaranteed to all Americans, for decades. They have waited decades for justice. They should not be forced to wait any longer.
So, where do we go from here? Joining me to discuss are Natasha Tidwell. She's an attorney with Calora LLP, former Cambridge police officer, former DOJ attorney, almost done, former assistant U.S. attorney. Nice to meet you, Natasha. Rasan Hall is back. He's the director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, also former deputy director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and a former assistant DA. Good to see you both. Rasan, as part of this decree that's now undone, give us a couple of things that the police department would have been required to do had they honored the terms of it.
Well, they'd had to be required to do some de-escalation training. They'd have to stop their pattern and practice of unjustified, unlawful stops of individuals. The whole revenue generation scheme that they had, where they were citing people for various infractions, failure to obey, failure to comply with a police officer, they wouldn't be allowed to do that anymore because those stops that they used lacked probable cause or any suspicion.
And they were required, this is one of the bones of contention, to pay cops more so they could attract a higher quality of applicant and ultimately police officer. So the findings were not equivocal. You probably know them better than I. They overtly discriminated against blacks. They use revenue raising, often using blacks as victims. I mean, there was no equivocation at all. What's the argument, if any, for Ferguson backing out of this deal? They agreed to it.
Well, they agreed to it in principle, right? I mean, I think the understanding was they'd always had to go through the city council before it was going to be final in terms of the city committing the funds and the resources to the settlement agreement. I think that the big bone of contention for the city ongoing has been a finance issue. It's sort of ironic that one of their biggest revenue streams, which was, you know, the use of municipal ordinances to fine predominantly black drivers or whomever, now that that's been cut off, they now don't have the money to pay to implement the...
They'd have to raise taxes.
They'd have to raise taxes, right.
So why'd they agree to it? I assume they're not dopes. They knew that they were in deficit. They knew this is going to cost more. Why did they even tentatively say yes?
I think, you know, it might be an instance of the left hand not realizing what the right hand was doing. I think once people realized, you know, well, yeah, we want all of these unconstitutional policing practices to stop, but it's going to affect my pocketbook. Well, let's hold on a minute. So I think the pressure on the city council got to be a little bit too great. I mean, I think another sticking point.
6-0 they voted against.
6-0. So I think, you know, the political pressure got to be for a town of only 21,000. It's personal. Your city councilor is someone who you know pretty well.
Well, not only a community of 21,000, a not terribly wealthy community of 21,000. Yeah. How's it in the interest of the Justice Department, even if the deal was perfect according to them, to negotiate a deal that's going to further tax, and I mean literally and figuratively, particularly since they're going to lose a lot of the revenue they've been unjustly accruing? How's it in their interest to have the city agree to something that they frankly can't afford?
I guess the bigger question, though, is what's the alternative? Because if they don't enter into some sort of agreement, what is the Ferguson Police Department?
More moderate terms, imperfect but affordable. That's the alternative, isn't it?
Possibly, but you really want deep, substantive, meaningful change to happen, and you just can't tweak it around the edges. You got to get in there and get deep, and so maybe it's something where it forces the city of Ferguson to look to the state for funding.
But the federal government never fills in blanks in these kinds of cases, do they? I mean, they're the ones that initiated this thing. They're not the wrongdoers.
Right.
Does the federal government ever have their determinations followed by cash to help fund them?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think they can provide technical support and training, the COPS program, and get other type of resources in there.
They did offer in this instance to provide some of the services to Ferguson.
The federal government.
They, the federal government. But to what extent that would be, I think another sticking point was if Ferguson said, okay, we're going to disband the department, department and let the state take over our police department or let another municipality take over the Ferguson police, the part of the settlement agreement was, well, the consent decree goes with that new department. So any
Why
department
shouldn't it go with them? They were even thinking of privatizing the cops. Why shouldn't you ensure that whoever the successor entity is, whether it's privatized, state, that they comply with it, particularly based on this history? They comply. If they comply, then end of discussion. Why shouldn't they be
Well,
forced?
from DOJ's perspective, absolutely.
But why, from a fairness perspective?
Well, because from Ferguson's perspective, if they were going to disband, their argument would be, I guess, well, all of the people who are responsible for putting us in this mess, we are going to just start from scratch, and we will implement some of the things, but not, under consent decree.
It seems to me, if money is the big issue, and at face value I assume it is, and they're about to be in the worst of all worlds. There was an analysis done of 67 of these suits filed by the Department of Justice over the last 20 years. They've won 66. So the odds are pretty good that the Justice Department's going to win. So the end game is going to be the city's going to spend millions of dollars on lawyers that they can't afford, and then is going to lose, and then have to spend the millions of dollars they said they couldn't afford on top of the millions of dollars. So it seems that even if they're responding to a concern about finances, they're sort of shooting themselves. Horrible choice of words here. My apologies.
They're digging a hole for themselves.
But it's like a double nightmare, no?
Well, I think that they, their hope probably is that this gives them a little bit more time to get back at the negotiating table. The
DOJ says they're not negotiating anything.
I think the judge who has the case right now, that a lawsuit does not mean that it's going to trial. It just means that now more lawyers are involved, and perhaps there's more room for a settlement down the end. So this is not the end to mean that a judge is going to have to find that you're going to have to do it anyway. It'll probably end up there, as you mentioned, DOJ's track record in these things, but it gives the city a little bit more time. And quite frankly, if they lose, to say, well, the judge made us do it versus me as your city councilor voted to do it.
So they CYA with their residents. From the Department of Justice thing, I'm just thinking though, litigation, if it's fought and not settled, means we'll go a longer period of time with some voluntary changes that have been already made, but essentially the reforming of the police department won't happen at all. So why is it not in their interest, the DOJ, to agree to an imperfect deal, but one that goes into effect immediately? Maybe the cops don't get as much money as they want them to get, but at least there'll be results now rather than prolonging this potentially for you. And by the way, Frontline just did a thing on a lot of these. Frontline says there's not even an evaluation about whether or not these consent decrees work and achieve the desired result. So why not cut a deal, even if it's not as good to begin with?
Sure, but I think you run into the same problem where you're cutting a deal. What's the difference between a deal and a consent decree? If there's no enforcement, there's no enforcement. And so why agree to something that sets a lower bar as opposed to getting something in writing that you could choose to go back to?
A lower bar if those 6 city councilors vote for it. I only have 30 seconds left, and I mean this sincerely. If you two sat in a room, could you cut a deal that the city could live with and that the Department of Justice and the Civil Liberties Union could agree with? I'm serious about that. Not because you know each other, but because the tensions are not there. Could you cut a deal? Look at them looking at each other.
That's right. Being the reasonable person that I am, as opposed to Rasan, I think that a deal could be cut. But I think there's a lot of different constituencies involved. It's very difficult. I think DOJ's consent decree in this area is pretty intense and pretty comprehensive.
But you have to agree, the horror that these people have lived through, the fact that it's not resolved and not on its way to fixing,
ongoing,
is just unthinkable.
But there's also a larger public pressure on this, and the optics around making sure that the deal that the DOJ cuts is one that is meaningful and is strong and gets to the heart of what the
agreed
problem is.
to.
And that they agreed to.
Natasha, it's great to meet you.
It's nice
Thanks
to
so
meet
much.
you, too.
Good to see
Thank
Rasan.
you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you again.